Marcy Thompson wasn't running away. At least that's what she told herself. She was starting over. The divorce had drained her, not just of money, but of spirit. And the city felt like a cage. Too many memories, too many accusing stares from well-meaning friends. When she found the farmhouse listing, it seemed like an answer to her prayers. Tucked into the rolling hills of a sleepy town she'd never heard of, it was exactly what she needed, a place to breathe. The realtor's smile faltered when they arrived. "It's got charm, doesn't it?" he said, fumbling with the keys. Marcy nodded, ignoring the way his eyes darted toward the house as though expecting it to do something. The house itself was a classic. Weathered white siding, green shutters, and a wide porch that sagged just enough to prove its age. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust, but Marcy could already picture it as a sanctuary. "You sure you want this place?" the realtor asked as she signed the papers. "Why wouldn't I?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Folks around here talk, but stories are just stories, right?" The first week was a whirlwind of unpacking and small home repairs. Marcy threw herself into the work, relishing the physicality of it. She patched leaks, painted walls, and even planted a small herb garden out back. At night, the silence was both a blessing and a curse. The city's constant hum had been replaced by an oppressive stillness. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside felt amplified. But Marcy told herself it was part of adjusting to country life. On the fourth night, she saw the face for the first time. It was fleeting, just a pale blur in the window by the stairs as she carried a box of books up to her room. She froze, her heart racing, but when she turned, the yard outside was empty. "Relax," she muttered, laughing nervously. "It's just your imagination." The next morning, Marcy stopped by the local diner for coffee and a sandwich. The place was charming in a kitschy way. Red vinyl booths and checkered floors. "You're the one who bought the Carter house," the waitress said, her tone too casual to be genuine. Marcy blinked. "Is that what it's called?" The waitress nodded, setting down her coffee. "No one's lived there for years. Last folks left in a hurry." "Why?" The waitress hesitated, glancing around before leaning in. "They said it was haunted. Folks around here think the house has a presence." Marcy rolled her eyes. "Let me guess. Faces in the windows? Strange noises?" The waitress didn't smile. "Something like that. You be careful out there, miss." That evening, Marcy couldn't shake the waitress's words. She tried to laugh it off, but as she climbed the stairs, her skin prickled with an uneasy awareness. She paused by the window where she'd seen the face, staring out into the dark yard. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and tired. And then it changed. For a brief moment, her reflection's eyes weren't hers. They were darker, deeper, filled with something wrong. She blinked, and it was gone. By the end of the week, Marcy had convinced herself she was overworked. She spent hours scrubbing the windows, rearranging furniture, and trying to ignore the feeling that the house was watching her. But the face kept appearing. Sometimes it was in the stairway window, other times reflected in the glass of a picture frame or the kitchen's antique cabinets. Always pale, always smiling. The real terror began on the night of the storm. Rain lashed against the house and thunder rattled the windows. Marcy was curled up on the couch, trying to read, when the lights flickered and went out. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the kitchen, cursing the storm under her breath. As she passed the stairwell, the beam of her flashlight caught something in the window. The face was there, clearer than ever. It was pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes staring directly at her. The grin stretched wider than should have been possible. Marcy screamed, stumbling back. The flashlight clattered to the floor, plunging her into darkness. When she scrambled to pick it up and shone the light at the window again, it was empty. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Marcy decided to explore the house's attic the next day. The realtor had mentioned it in passing but claimed it was just storage. The attic door was in the hallway ceiling, hidden behind a pull-down ladder. It creaked as she climbed up, her flashlight cutting through the dust-choked darkness. The attic was empty, except for a single trunk in the corner. Inside, she found faded photographs of a family, a man, woman, and 2 children. They stood in front of the farmhouse smiling brightly. But in the background of every photo, barely visible in the windows of the house, was the same pale face. Marcy tried to leave the house that evening. She packed a bag and grabbed her car keys, but the engine wouldn't start. She called for a tow, but the storm had knocked out the cell tower. As night fell, the house seemed to come alive. The creaks and groans grew louder, more deliberate. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision. And then she heard it. Footsteps above her. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. At the top, the hallway stretched before her, impossibly long. The face was waiting in the window. It wasn't just a face anymore. It was a figure, pale and gaunt, with arms too long and a smile too wide. "Get out," Marcy whispered to herself, backing away. But the door slammed shut behind her. The last thing she saw was the face, inches from hers, its hollow eyes filling her vision as everything went dark. Jessica Sterling's Victorian home stood like a relic from another time. Its gabled roof and turreted corners a silent testimony to an era when things were built to last. She had poured her savings into restoring it, carefully curating every detail to match its original grandeur. To her, the house wasn't just a place to live. It was a project, a living, breathing canvas for her love of history. It was during one of her frequent hunts for antiques that she found the mirror. The shop was tucked away on a side street in a neighboring town, its windows clouded with dust and its interior smelling of mildew and forgotten memories. The mirror stood propped against the far wall, draped in a sheet that looked as ancient as the building itself. Jessica pulled the cloth away and gasped. It was magnificent. The tarnished silver frame shimmered faintly, even in the dim light, and the carvings along its edges seemed to twist and writhe as she stared. They weren't just decorative. They told a story, though not one Jessica could decipher. The glass itself was pristine, too clean for something so old, and it seemed to hum faintly under her fingers when she touched it. "How much for this?" she asked, her voice almost reverent. The shopkeeper hesitated. "It's not for sale." Jessica's heart sank. "Everything's for sale," she said, flashing him a charming smile. "I'll pay double." The man shifted uncomfortably. "It's just, there's something about that mirror. People who've owned it say it's strange." "Strange?" she echoed, her curiosity piqued. He looked away. "It's just an old mirror," he said finally, but his tone lacked conviction. "If you want it that badly, it's yours." Jessica left the shop with the mirror, and a strange sense of triumph. She didn't know why, but she felt as though she had won something. She just didn't know what. The mirror fit perfectly in the guest room. Too perfectly. Jessica hung it on the far wall, opposite the bed, where the morning light would catch the silver frame and make it gleam. As she stepped back to admire it, she felt a strange flutter in her chest, like a distant echo of anxiety. But the feeling passed, and she spent the rest of the day arranging the room around her newest treasure. By evening, she had forgotten the shopkeeper's warning entirely. The house was always quiet at night. Jessica loved that about it. The way the walls seemed to soak up sound, leaving only the soft creaks of the floorboards and the occasional groan of the old pipes. But on the first night after she brought the mirror home, she heard something new. A whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, and for a moment she thought it might be the wind. But as she lay in bed straining to listen, the sound grew louder. It wasn't coming from the windows or the walls. It was coming from the guest room. Jessica crept down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed the door open, half expecting to find someone standing there. But the room was empty, bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. The mirror stood silent and still, its surface reflecting the room behind her with perfect clarity. She turned to leave, but the whispering started again. This time, she was sure it was coming from the mirror. By the third night, the whispers had become a nightly occurrence. They were louder now, though still unintelligible, and Jessica found herself avoiding the guest room during the day. The mirror seemed different somehow, its surface darker, as though it were holding something just out of sight. One evening, as she stared into the glass, she noticed something strange. Her reflection moved with her, but there was a slight delay, a fraction of a second where the image lagged behind her movements. And then, there were the shadows. They flickered and danced in the corners of the mirror, shapes that didn't exist in the room itself. Jessica tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but deep down, she knew better. The turning point came when Jessica decided to move the mirror. She couldn't explain why, but the thought of it staying in her house any longer filled her with dread. She called a neighbor for help, but when they tried to lift it, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the mirror had grown roots, fusing itself to the floor. "That's impossible," Jessica muttered, her voice trembling. Her neighbor gave her a strange look. "Are you sure you want to keep this thing? It's unsettling." Jessica didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at the mirror, her reflection staring back with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the guest room empty. The mirror was shattered, its shards scattered across the floor, but Jessica was nowhere to be found. Her disappearance became a local legend, the kind of story parents tell their children to keep them out of trouble. The house was sold, and the mirror's shards disappeared into private collections. But strange things started happening to those who owned a piece. Whispers in the night, shadows in the corners of their vision, and always the sense that they were being watched. Some say Jessica's reflection still lingers in the shards, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone to put the mirror back together. And when they do, she'll be waiting. Derek Grayson had grown up on the edges of Hollow Creek, a small town where the woods behind the Carter farm were more than just a shadowy thicket of trees. They were a legend, a dark patch of forest everyone avoided, whispered about in hushed tones. People spoke of strange sounds at night, childish giggles, ghostly whispers, and the unmistakable creak of something heavy swaying in the branches. When Derek was a boy, his friends dared each other to step just past the tree line, but no one ever lingered. It was said that once you entered the hollow woods, the woods would decide if you were allowed to leave. Derek never bought into the tales. To him, it was just another spooky story meant to keep kids from wandering too far. That changed the day Max went missing. It started as a typical afternoon. Derek was repairing the fence in his backyard, keeping an eye on Max as the golden retriever sniffed around the property's edge. The air was damp, thick with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. Max barked sharply, a sound of curiosity, not alarm, and bolted toward the woods. "Max," Derek called, wiping his hands on his jeans. The dog didn't stop. He ran to the edge of the trees, scanning the dim path. "Max, get back here." The dog's barks grew fainter, swallowed by the woods. With a muttered curse, Derek grabbed a flashlight from the porch and stepped into the trees. The woods were colder than he expected, the air pressing against him like a damp shroud. His boots sank into the mossy ground, each step muffled. The light was strange here, filtered through a dense canopy of gnarled branches that twisted overhead like arthritic fingers. "Max." His voice sounded small, swallowed by the silence. He listened, straining to hear the familiar jingle of Max's collar. Instead, there was nothing, not even the rustle of leaves or the call of birds. It wasn't long before he realized he had no idea how far he'd gone. The trees all looked the same, their bark dark and slick with moisture. The flashlight beam flickered, the weak light barely penetrating the thick mist that coiled around him like living smoke. And then he saw it. The clearing opened suddenly, as if the woods themselves had exhaled. Derek stumbled into it, the oppressive air lifting just enough to make him feel exposed. At its center stood an object that didn't belong. A carousel. It was old, its wooden frame warped and weathered. The paint had peeled away in long, curling strips, revealing splinters and bare wood beneath. The horses were frozen mid-gallop, their glassy eyes staring into the fog. Some were missing chunks of their bodies, exposing the skeletal framework beneath the paint. Derek's breath caught in his throat. The stories had never mentioned this. At first, he thought it was the wind, a faint, high-pitched sound carried on the mist. But as he stepped closer, he realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was laughter. Children's laughter, bright and carefree, echoed through the clearing. Derek spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the trees. There was no one there. But when he turned back to the carousel, the horses seemed different. Their eyes gleamed, their painted mouths curling into subtle, sinister grins. The laughter grew louder, and shapes began to materialize around the carousel. Small, darting figures. Children. They ran in circles, their footsteps soundless, their movements too fast to follow. "Hey!" Derek called, his voice breaking. "What the hell is this?" One by one, the children stopped. Derek's breath hitched as they turned to face him. Their clothes were old-fashioned, Lace collars, suspenders, pinafores. But their faces were wrong, blurred like a photograph taken with a shaky hand. Where eyes and mouths should have been, there were only smudges, shifting and writhing as though trying to take shape. One child stepped forward, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its face solidified, lips stretching into a smile that was too wide, revealing rows of sharp, glinting teeth. Derek stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Max?" he called desperately, his voice cracking. The child's smile widened. "Stay," it whispered, its voice a chorus of many, layered and hollow, behind him. The trees began to shift. The branches seemed to grow, reaching down like claws, closing off the path he'd taken. The carousel began to move. Slowly at first, its platform creaking as it turned. The horses bobbed up and down, their painted eyes rolling wildly. A distorted tune began to play, the notes wobbling and out of tune. The children climbed onto the carousel, their blurred faces turned toward Derek. The music grew louder, drowning out the sound of his own panicked breathing. He tried to run, but the fog thickened, wrapping around his legs and dragging him back toward the clearing. The last thing Derek saw before the fog consumed him was Max. The dog stood at the edge of the carousel, his fur matted and his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He barked once, but the sound was wrong, echoing and hollow, like it came from somewhere far away, and then Derek was gone. Weeks passed before anyone noticed Derek's disappearance. The sheriff organized a search party, but they found no trace of him or Max. The woods gave nothing back. The stories of the hollow woods grew darker, whispered from one generation to the next. People spoke of a strange carousel deep within the forest, a place where the lost went to play. Some claimed to hear the sound of carousel music on misty nights, faint and haunting. Others said they'd seen figures, children with blurred faces, dancing among the trees. But no one dared go looking. Not anymore. Because once you entered the hollow woods, you didn't come back.